Hey everyone, it's Alexander, the real Mr. Robinson. Welcome to the channel. And today I'm going to be talking about one of my absolute favorite TV shows from my childhood. Probably a show I shouldn't have been watching in my childhood, but I am talking about MXC, Most Extreme Elimination Challenge. Now this is a show that I didn't plan on reviewing anytime soon, but for some reason over the past few days, I don't know how I thought back to the show, but it was just one of those things where it was like a rush, like, oh, I remember that show. And so it was on my mind. I'm like, well, why not talk about it? It was a big part of my childhood, and this show's just awesome. So if you don't know the premise of MXC, it's pretty much based off of, and I say based off of in the loosest way possible, Takeshi's Castle, which was a Japanese TV show that aired from 1986 to 1990 in Japan. The original show starred Takeshi Kitano as Count Takeshi, who owns this massive castle, and there's legions of players that have to go through these obstacles in order to pretty much overthrow him. And leading the charge against Count Takeshi is General Tani, and right next to Count Beat Takeshi, as his full name goes, Sonomana Higashi, who is Count's advisor. And the original Japanese show is actually pretty cool. I haven't seen a ton of episodes, and every time I try to find them on YouTube, they're usually like a reworked British version, which I prefer the full Japanese version anyway, but the show's a lot of fun, and the way I've actually seen those episodes were from DVDs of MXC. They would include at least one Takeshi's Castle episode in its original form. So that show's pretty neat, and it would be cool if there was some way to actually see this show with subtitles and see every episode. But anyway, back to MXC. This show is based off Takeshi's Castle only in the fact that it uses footage from that show, because everything else is a completely different show almost. It pretty much functions as a game show where you have two announcers, you have two teams of contestants fighting each other in these various amounts of obstacles, except there's no real winner at the end of the day. It's almost like these contestants are just performing for these two announcers' amusements. And the two announcers in question are Vic Romano and Kenny Blankenship. If you've ever seen Dodgeball, a true underdog story, which I actually reviewed earlier this year, you'll remember the characters of Cotton McKnight, played by Gary Cole, and Pepper Brooks, played by Jason Bateman. If you put those two characters right next to Vic Romano and Kenny Blankenship, it would literally be the same thing. Like, there would be no difference at all. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest if Rawson Marshall Thurber was a big fan of MXC. And for those of you who are not familiar with MXC at all and don't even know what it is, you might be thinking to yourself, you just described a game show. What else is there to really talk about? Well, if you have a nostalgic attachment to the show, or you've been watching it since it began airing on Spike TV, then there's quite a lot to talk about. It's just an awesome, bonkers show. And like I said before, it's probably one that I was maybe too young to watch. I mean, 2003, I was 12 years old, so I guess I was old enough to at least watch it, but a lot of the stuff they were saying I didn't understand, and it wasn't until I reached my adulthood that I really understood what they were saying, and I was like, oh, this is nasty. This is foul, disgusting. Yeah, I mean, thank God when I was a kid there was some form of entertainment, just seeing a bunch of people get bashed around, do these ridiculous obstacle courses. Like, it's a nuts show, Takeshi's Castle or MXC. I mean, there are some crazy, insane games that they send these contestants through. I don't know the Japanese names of any of these games, so I'm just gonna go by what MXC names them as. Like, you got games like the Rotating Surfboard of Death, Sinkers and Floaters, Irritable Bowl Syndrome, Log Drop, one of the Dash to Death. I was just laughing at one of the other names of the shows, Yank My Dinghy, which you could see the gross factor that this show has. Like, it's, when you watch it and you really understand all the stuff they're saying, like, it's incredibly immature, it's complete lowbrow humor, but there's just something about it that makes me laugh every time I watch it. But even as an adult, me understanding all the nasty stuff that they're talking about and all the sexual or disgusting innuendos, I get a kick out of just seeing these contestants bash their brains out. Not literally, but the things that these contestants go through, it's the stuff of beauty. Like, there's always a segment at the end of the episodes called Kenny Blankenship's Painful Eliminations of the Day. And it's pretty much the equivalent of the creators going, hey, did you have fun watching all these people bash their brains and just get critically injured? Well, here are 10 of the best eliminations, and here, enjoy it again in all its glory. And the teams that they would pit against each other, I mean, most of the time, it's two teams that literally have no business going up against each other. Like, the very first episode was meat handlers versus voice actors. There'd be other episodes like aerospace workers versus the fast food industry. There would be, oh god, what else there? Wedding industry versus truckers. Toy industry versus office workers. But there would also be some matchups that actually made sense, even though, again, none of this happens in the original Takeshi's Castle. For example, you have cons versus cops, you have Republicans versus Democrats versus the third party, you have blue-collar workers versus white-collar workers, you have Greeks versus geeks. I mean, in that sense, there are some matchups that make sense. I mean, really, nothing in this show makes any sense at all. But really, you don't care about seeing who fights who and who's going to come out on top. All you care about are seeing these people getting eliminated and just going through utter hell to compete in these games. One of the things that really makes me laugh more than the actual injuries is just seeing these contestants fall into the most disgusting water you've ever seen in a TV show. Ever. I mean, if I were to guess, I would assume that they built these games in an area where the water mixes with the dirt, and that's why it looks as disgusting as it does. But within the context of MXC, in their interpretation, they pretty much say it's sewage water, it's just sludge. Like, it just looks so disgusting that the showrunners just come up with the most disgusting substance possible to substitute it for. Now let's get back to the characters, because I mentioned Vic Romano and Kenny Blankenship. Two characters who are complete polar opposites of one another. Vic Romano is very professional, he's insightful, he's intelligent, whereas Kenny Blankenship, he's the partier, he's not all that bright, and sometimes he suffers from Homer Simpson syndrome, where in the first few seasons, it seems like he's a pretty smart guy, but not as smart as Vic Romano. And then later on in the series, it seems like he's getting dumber and dumber and dumber. And as a kid, he was always my favorite character, because the stuff he'd say is just so ridiculous. And the way Kenny Blankenship's voice actor, Chris Darga, just delivers the lines makes me laugh uncontrollably as well. But despite being complete opposites of one another, the two characters actually work very well together, and their chemistry, I'm gonna go on a limb here and say it's one of the greatest dynamic duos in any form of TV, even though it uses footage straight from another TV show. Vic and Kenny are some of my favorite dynamic duos out there. And then you have Captain Tennille, who sets the contestants off into their games, and he's the character that all the contestants just fawn over. He's never wrong. Within this show's universe, Captain Tennille is probably the most popular character out there, and whenever he insults a contestant, they just kind of go with it because they really can't say anything back. And he probably has some of the most iconic catchphrases in the series. When the matches start and the contestants are on their way, he'll go, "Let's go!" And whenever the individual games start, before the first contestant shows up, he'll usually do, "Get it on!" Just like that. "Get it on!" Or, "Get it on!" Just, it's fun to say. Get it on! And then there's LaDouche. Guy LaDouche is... If you've seen the show, I don't think there's a whole lot to say about this character. He is just so... I don't even know how to describe him. He's like gross, he's perverted, he's flamboyant a lot of the times. He is just very questionable as a character. And the accent, the French accent that he just has the entire time. Guy here. Like, it's hilarious. And there will be a handful of episodes where Guy actually doesn't show up, and instead he's replaced by another field reporter who usually is a relative of Guy, like Geek Ladouche, Giddy, Gip, Goon, Gab, Jin, Gidget, Gal. Whenever Guy or any member of the Ladouche family is on screen, you know things are going to get very interesting and probably uncomfortable. And the very first episode of the series, where it's meat handlers versus voice actors, there's an interview that Guy conducts that pretty much sums up the entirety of his character, and in a way is the birth of Guy Ladouche, where he asks a couple if they take their camera into the bedroom, and the girl says yes, and Guy's like, oh, you film each other, that is so nutty, you look at the camera, oh, look, are you nutty? Oh, ha, 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 oh, ha, 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 ha. And then it just cuts to Kenny and Vic with this blank expression, and they're like, thanks, Guy. And I remember seeing that transition for the first time after that interview and just seeing the expressions on Kenny and Vic's face and laughing hysterically. Like, as a kid, I gotta get it together. I'm laughing just thinking about this show. As a kid, this show got more laughs out of me than anything I've ever watched. I mean, a lot of people watch Jackass. I was more of an MXC guy more than Jackass because this show was just bonkers. And because all the footage is taken from a Japanese TV show that probably didn't have to worry about a lot of copyright stuff, you'd find a lot of pre-existing IPs within MXC, but renamed to something ridiculous. One of the more famous episodes of the series is the Monsters vs. Mascots episode, which is essentially their Halloween episode. And a lot of the monsters featured in that episode are clearly Ultraman monsters. I never watched Ultraman myself, but there was one specific monster that I had a toy of long before I even watched the show. And when this episode aired and that monster popped up, I was like, oh shit, I have that toy. And the very last game of that episode, The Impassable Stones of Mount McKidney, you have a bunch of Ultramen just throwing boulders down at the contestants, and one of the contestants being Slimer from Ghostbusters, who has been renamed in MXC as the Laughing Loogie, and again, that goes to show the immature nature of the show. And speaking of monsters, I could not live with myself if I didn't mention this specific episode and this specific cameo. There's an episode called Amusement Parks versus World's Oldest Profession. There's a little moment right before one of the games where Kenny and Vic are playing with some remote-controlled arcade-type game. It's kind of hard to explain. And then Kenny says, yeah, but wait till I bring out the secret weapon. And who should pop out around the corner? But Godzilla. It's Godzilla wearing a bike helmet and holding a laser gun while on some sort of remote-controlled platform. And I was just like, what? Godzilla? Like, how did you get away with Godzilla in MXC? But in MXC, they can't call him Godzilla, just like they can't call Slimer Slimer. So instead, they named him Hodan the Killer Dinosaur Pimp. You can't make this stuff up. Like, you really cannot make it up. But that episode popped up, and I saw Godzilla on MXC. I'm like, okay, greatest show ever. And for me, in my mind, the show was already deemed the greatest show ever when they did an almost live episode at Universal Studios Florida. I'm like, man, this show's got giant monsters, it's got people hurting themselves, it's got an episode that takes place at Universal Orlando, and it's got Godzilla in one episode. I'm loving this show. Now let's talk about this almost live episode. By 2004, when the third season was about to premiere, MXC had become such a big deal that they decided to just make their own original episode. They filmed it at the old Nickelodeon studios at Universal Studios Florida, and some shots you can actually see the buildings that feature Shrek 4D and Jimmy Neutron's Nicktoon Blast without having to blur them over. And the show had enough money to actually bring in Tony Hawk and Tara Dakitas as the team captains for the Greeks and Geeks, but in the reverse order. I mean, Tony Hawk, team captain of the Geeks, and Tara Dakitas as the team captain for the Greeks. And it was pretty much a bunch of college students competing in 4 games: Wallbangers, Sinkers and Floaters, Window Pane, and Log Drop. And the funny thing is that both Tony Hawk and Tara Dakitas are the only 2 people in the entirety of MXC that are not dubbed over. And I recently found out that this episode was on YouTube in full and was uploaded in 2017. I'm like, wait, you mean this episode that was never released on DVD has been floating on YouTube for 3 years and I missed it? Or maybe I just wasn't paying attention to MXC anymore, but I rewatched that episode and I just really want to know what all these college students were saying when they were competing in this game, how they feel about it now, because one of the things that really can be problematic is that this is a Spike TV show. Spike TV was once known as the first network for men. And there are a lot of moments in this series, especially in the Almost Live episode, where they can be a little discriminatory towards women. And by that, I mean paint them as objects. So that's one element of the show that I don't think really holds up. Another is that there's some episodes that really show how dated the show was. And I'm not talking about Takeshi's Castle, I'm talking about MXC. Because some of the episodes that they specifically do for MXC really date the series. For example, there's Superheroes versus MySpace and Bush versus Carrie. So, yeah, outdated right there. But anyway, getting back to the Almost Live episode, I would really love to hear the original dialogue of the series, whether they were just directed to say gibberish and they'll just dub it over later, or if some of these people actually had stuff to say. Because throughout the entirety of this series, all the contestants will say something that's incredibly random, out of context, or just downright stupid. And in the Almost Live episode, there's actually a joke where one of the contestants is saying, "It doesn't matter what I'm saying, you're just gonna overdub my voice anyway." And then Kenny and Vic are just like, huh? Overdub? What's he talking about? I don't know. So you gotta think that some of the people competing in this Almost Live episode were fans of MXC, and I would imagine that both Tony Hawk and Tara Takitas were fans as well if they had the money to bring them in. I almost kind of wish that they did more Almost Live episodes later on, because when you get to seasons 4 and 5, that's honestly where the show starts to go downhill for me. I won't say it's terrible, but it just feels kind of lazy to the point where they often reuse the same footage that they used in past episodes. So if you're one of those guys out there that really likes to pay attention to the games and who's going to win, or is your favorite team going to come out on top, then you're going to be really disappointed when they reuse footage from another episode, because you kind of know what's going to happen, and it almost feels unfair if you're just watching this show for the first time. But in a way, I guess there were more MXC Live episodes. It just went into the form of Wipeout, which I don't hate Wipeout. I honestly don't get the hate from MXC fans about this show, because really, this show does what MXC does best as well. Watching people go through these obstacles in these games and get seriously hurt or just fall all over the place. If there was any way where I could see eye to eye with the people that don't like Wipeout, it's the fact that MXC just seems a little more crazy, because nobody does crazy game shows like the Japanese. Now I want to get back to the 4th and 5th seasons of MXC, because that's when the show just kind of lost its momentum. Like I said before, MXC was such a big deal that they did an Almost Live episode with Tony Hawk and Tara Takitas. And it was probably the most popular show that Spike TV had. And by the time you got to seasons 4 and 5, the show's TV rating got increased from TV PG to TV 14. The shows got even more vulgar, and it just, again, it wasn't unwatchable, because when you watch all these contestants go through the games, it's still very entertaining, but all the stuff that doesn't involve those contestants just feels a bit tired. And because they pushed some of the crude humor even further with these last 2 seasons, it just feels a little more gross. And maybe I was just falling out with MXC at the time and focusing on other stuff, but I just don't think the last 2 seasons of the show match up with the first 3 seasons. Especially those first 2 seasons. I absolutely adore seasons 1 and 2 of MXC. And looking at it with the perspective of today's culture, the show does have a lot of jokes that just would not fly today. For example, they often make fun of gay people, they fat shame some contestants. There are just a lot of jokes scattered throughout this series, even in its early days, where you're like, that's not really that funny. So I can see how the show can be problematic for somebody who's watching this for the first time and didn't grow up with it. And also, the last thing I have to mention before I wrap things up is how this show pretty much got canceled in the most anticlimactic way possible. Season 5 was the final season of MXC, and their last episode was College Sports versus the Mall of Baghdad. And after that episode, I actually spent a long time waiting for the next episode to pop up, and I kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And after waiting for about half a year, I just came to the conclusion that MXC's done. Like, it got canceled without even an announcement being made about its cancellation, and that's such an anticlimactic way for the most popular show on Spike TV to go out. And even though I said the last 2 seasons aren't unwatchable or even terrible, I am a little bit bitter about Season 5, because as a dumb teenager and just rooting for your favorite teams to win, even though there were no consequences, there were no episodes where any of the teams I was rooting for won. So again, as a dumb teenager, I'm a little bitter by that, but watching it with an adult mindset, it just doesn't come across as funny or as fresh as it originally was in its first 3 seasons. But I think if you just go into the series with the mindset of this was when it was made at the time, you gotta take into context of what was deemed acceptable versus what's not considered acceptable today. And if you go into that with that mindset, then I think you're going to have a really good time. Again, I think the first 3 seasons, especially the first 2, are the best the series has ever been. And those first 2 seasons really get the biggest laughs out of me. And also, this show makes for a great drinking game. There's somebody on Reddit that actually made an entire guideline of how to do an MXC drinking game right here. I don't recall if I've ever done any drinking games in my life, maybe once, because I'm not a big drinker, honestly. But with this here, I would honestly be glad. I'd be excited to do an MXC drinking game, whether with you guys or a bunch of my friends when this whole pandemic dies down. And just based on these rules, I think it could be a ton of fun. Especially if I'm watching this series with a bunch of people who have never seen MXC. That would be something that would be worth recording and just documenting. So maybe one day when this whole pandemic dies down and we can all be in the same room and hang out again, I'd love to do a drinking game of MXC. I think it would just be a ton of fun. So if I were to actually give MXC a rating, I'm actually going to give it 2 ratings. The first is the series as a whole, and that would be good but not great. There's a lot in this series that will make you laugh hard, and mainly it's with the games themselves. And there are a few moments with Kenny and Vic when they're waiting for the next game to start that I think are incredibly hilarious as well. But the last 2 seasons get more grotesque, more vulgar, and just less funny. So that's why, as a whole, I say it's good but not great. But if you're just judging this series based on the first 2 seasons, it is worth seeing in your lifetime. I really think that the first 2 seasons of MXC are just fantastic. They are fall out of your seat funny. They're vulgar and crude and immature, but yet clever at the same time. It's just a blast to watch. And I dare anyone, whether you're watching this again or for the first time, I dare you to not get excited and just get hyped up whenever you hear that theme song. The MXC theme really, I get hyped every time I hear it. I just want to go run out, do something awesome. It's an awesome theme song. So yeah, if you've never seen MXC before, I would highly recommend it, especially the first 2 seasons, and the 3rd season's pretty good as well. But again, you'd have to go into the mindset of when this series was made and the type of stuff that was acceptable to make fun of, which in hindsight was never acceptable to make fun of to begin with. And there you go, that's my review for MXC. Now I want to know what you guys think about the series. If you've seen it, what did you think? If you grew up with the series like I did, and especially if you grew up at a time where you probably were too young to watch MXC, what were your favorite memories of this show? Whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below. And until next time, I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, leave a comment, support my Patreon page, follow me on social media, and until then, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you there is only one. And what do we always say? don't get eliminated!